I never expected that the most uncomfortable night of my life would begin with my wife fixing my tie in the hallway mirror like everything between us was perfectly normal. Claire always did that before events. She'd stand close, fingers moving carefully under my collar, smoothing the knot while staring at our reflection like she was studying a painting she hadn't quite finished yet. "You look nervous," she said. "I'm not," I lied. She smiled softly, the way she always did when she thought she knew me better than I knew myself. "It's just a work party, Mark. You act like you're being called into court." If only she knew. The invitation had come 3 weeks earlier, printed on thick white cardstock with a company logo stamped in silver. Annual Investor Appreciation Night, hosted at the Monarch Hotel downtown. Claire had been excited in a way I hadn't seen in months. She'd carried that envelope around the house like it was a golden ticket. Her startup had exploded in the last year, tech logistics platform, something about optimizing delivery routes for regional retailers. I never pretended to fully understand it, but investors loved it, venture capitalists loved it, and apparently half the logistics industry suddenly needed it. She had built it from nothing, or at least that's what she believed. When she first told me about the party, she was standing in the kitchen, barefoot, laptop open on the counter, eyes glowing. "They're introducing the major asset holders to the leadership team," she said. "I finally get to meet some of the silent partners." My stomach dropped so hard I had to sit down. "Oh yeah?" I said. "Yeah, some of them own huge portions of the company, but nobody's ever met them. They invested through holding groups." She shrugged like it was normal. In our world, it kind of was. "Apparently, one investor owns almost 90% of the infrastructure assets we operate on," she added. I remember staring at the countertop, tracing a scratch in the granite with my finger, because she was talking about me. Technically, she wasn't wrong. Her company owned the brand, the software, the employees, the contracts, but the warehouses, the vehicle fleet, the server farms, the entire physical backbone that allowed her platform to exist, that belonged to my holding company, and 90% of those assets were in my name. She had no idea. The crazy part is I never meant to hide it. 5 years ago, Claire had been working 12-hour days at a shipping firm that treated her like a glorified spreadsheet. She'd come home exhausted, complaining about inefficiencies she thought she could solve if anyone would actually listen. One night she showed me a rough concept she'd drawn up. "This could change how mid-sized retailers move inventory," she said. Her excitement was contagious. At the time, I was already running a mid-tier asset management group, quiet money, warehousing real estate, transport infrastructure, logistics hardware. Nothing flashy, just stable investments. But when I saw what she was building, something clicked. Her software needed infrastructure to scale, infrastructure I already owned. I suggested she pitch the idea to some investors I knew. She didn't know those investors were, technically, me. The funding came through a layered holding structure that looked like half a dozen separate companies. Claire assumed she'd convinced a collection of investors to believe in her vision. In reality, I had simply shifted assets I already controlled into her orbit. At the time, it felt romantic, supportive, like I was building a safety net under the tightrope she was walking. What I didn't expect was how quickly the company would grow. Within 2 years, her platform was operating in 15 states. Warehouses that belonged to my subsidiaries were suddenly processing massive retail contracts through her system. Our logistics network expanded so quickly that outside investors began pouring money into the software side. Claire became the face of a rising tech company. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, my holdings quietly became the structural skeleton of her empire. She knew the assets were leased through holding firms. She just didn't know who owned those firms. By year 4, the numbers had gotten uncomfortable. Her company was valued at over $400 million, and almost all of its operational infrastructure was tied to entities controlled by me. Not because I wanted power, just because the system had grown that way. I kept telling myself I'd explain it someday, but every year it became harder, because Claire's identity was tied to the idea that she built everything on her own. Every magazine article framed her as the self-made founder who fought her way into a brutal industry. Every award ceremony introduced her as the visionary who created a logistics revolution from nothing but grit. And every time I sat in the audience clapping while she gave those speeches, I felt like I was holding a secret grenade. Not because she didn't deserve success. She absolutely did. Her software was brilliant. Her leadership was real. But the foundation underneath it all was me. And the longer I waited, the worse the truth would sound. By the time the invitation to Investor Appreciation Night arrived, I knew the clock had run out, because the event schedule included something that made my chest tighten the moment I saw it: asset leadership introductions, which meant the company executives would finally meet the asset holders who controlled the infrastructure contracts, which meant someone from my holding company would need to appear.
I considered sending one of my managers, but Claire had specifically written my name on the RSVP. Spouse is welcome, she said, smiling. She had no idea. So there I was that evening, standing in the hallway while she adjusted my tie. You really are nervous, she said again. I'm just tired. She kissed my cheek. Tonight's a big deal for me. I know. We drove downtown just after 7. The Monarch Hotel was one of those glass towers that tried to look modest while quietly charging $12 for bottled water. Valets in black coats opened our doors. Claire stepped out first, smoothing her dark blue dress. She looked confident, successful, proud. Inside, the ballroom buzzed with the quiet arrogance of wealthy people pretending to be humble. Investors, executives, consultants, champagne glasses everywhere. Claire was instantly pulled into conversations, people congratulating her, asking about expansion, talking about the next funding round. I stayed close, but mostly quiet, because the deeper we moved into the room, the more I recognized faces. Several of the investors chatting near the bar were actually managers from subsidiaries I owned. They recognized me immediately. One of them froze mid-conversation when our eyes met. I gave a small, subtle shake of my head. Not here. Not yet. Eventually, Claire dragged me toward a tall man in a gray suit. Mark, this is Daniel from VentureBridge Garbol, she said. Daniel shook my hand. Your wife is building something incredible. Yeah, I said. She really is. Claire squeezed my arm. Moments later, someone tapped her shoulder. Claire, they're starting the introduction soon. Her face lit up. Finally, I get to meet the mystery asset people. She grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the stage. My heart started pounding, because I knew exactly what was about to happen.
The company's CFO stepped onto the small platform and tapped the microphone. Good evening, everyone. The room quieted. We'd like to take a moment tonight to recognize the strategic asset partners whose infrastructure made our growth possible. Claire leaned closer to me, whispering, I've never met any of them. This is so weird. I forced a smile. The CFO began listing companies, warehouse groups, fleet leasing firms, server infrastructure providers, each name representing pieces of my network. And then he said the one name that mattered, Harrison Asset Holdings. Claire frowned slightly. Who are they? She whispered. I didn't answer. The CFO continued, representing Harrison Asset Holdings tonight, my chest tightened, is their principal majority owner. Claire watched the stage with curious interest. Then the CFO said my name, Mark Harrison. Claire turned toward me slowly, confused, waiting for me to laugh, but I didn't move. And the moment she realized I wasn't joking, her expression changed in a way I will never forget for the rest of my life. Claire kept staring at me like the room had suddenly started speaking a language she didn't understand. At first, she actually laughed, not a real laugh, more like the reflexive sound someone makes when they assume they just heard a joke. Okay, she said under her breath, very funny. But the applause started around us. People were turning, looking directly at me, waiting. The CFO gestured politely toward the stage. Mark, my legs felt like they belonged to someone else. I stepped forward. Behind me, I heard Claire say quietly, What the hell? Each step toward that stage felt like walking deeper into a story I had waited 5 years to tell, and suddenly wished I never had. When I reached the platform, the CFO shook my hand. Glad you could make it. Yeah, I said, my voice coming out lower than usual. The microphone sat on the podium. I hadn't planned to speak. In fact, I had hoped I wouldn't need to. But the room was watching. Investors, executives, Claire. I leaned slightly toward the mic. Good evening. A few polite nods around the room. I'm not much of a speech guy, I said. I mostly work behind spreadsheets and contracts. A small ripple of light laughter. I glanced toward the crowd. Claire was still standing where I left her. Her face looked pale under the ballroom lights. Confusion, suspicion, something darker starting to rise behind it. I looked away before it hit me too hard. Harrison Asset Holdings has partnered with Claire's company since its early stages, I continued. We've always believed the infrastructure should support good ideas, and her idea was worth betting on. More polite applause. I kept it short, thanked the team, stepped away from the mic. But when I walked off the stage, the room felt completely different, because now people were looking at Claire instead of me, and they were whispering. You could almost hear the math happening in their heads. The company founder's husband, the majority infrastructure owner. It didn't take a genius to connect those dots. I walked back toward her slowly. She didn't move. Her arms were folded tight across her chest. What? She said quietly. Was that? Her voice wasn't loud, but it had a sharp edge that made my stomach twist. We should talk somewhere quieter, I said. No, she replied immediately. We'll talk right here. A few people nearby pretended very hard not to listen. You own Harrison Holdings? She asked. Yes. Since when? Since before your company launched.
Her eyes blinked rapidly, like her brain was struggling to process the sentence. You're telling me, she said slowly, that the asset group that owns the warehouses, the server farms, the entire logistics backbone, I noted, is you. Yes. For a second, she just stared. Then she laughed again. This time, it wasn't nervous. It was sharp, disbelieving. Okay, she said. Okay, so you're a minority partner or something? A small piece? I didn't answer immediately. Her eyes narrowed. How much, Mark? The noise of the ballroom faded into background static. 90%, I said quietly. The silence between us felt like something breaking. Her mouth opened slightly. 90%, she repeated. Of the assets. Of the infrastructure, I clarified. Her head tilted like she was trying to look at me from a different angle, like maybe the man standing in front of her wasn't the one she married. You've been, what, my landlord this whole time? She asked. That's not what this is. Oh, really? Her voice rose slightly, because from where I'm standing it looks exactly like that. A few nearby guests suddenly found their phones very interesting. I leaned closer. Claire, I didn't do this to control you. Then why didn't you tell me? The question landed harder than anything else, because there wasn't a clean answer. I wanted you to succeed on your own, I said. Her eyes flashed. Don't give me that. It's the truth. No, she snapped. The truth is you let me believe I built this company with outside investors. You did build it. While my husband secretly owned the ground it stands on? She shook her head slowly. That's not support, Mark. That's manipulation. That's not fair. Not fair? She said, almost laughing again. I've spent 5 years pitching to investors, negotiating contracts, stressing about infrastructure costs, fighting for every inch of growth. Her voice trembled, and the whole time my husband was sitting on 90% of the system and never said a word. I glanced around. People were definitely listening now. Let's step outside, I said again. She held my gaze for another long moment. Then she turned abruptly and walked toward the ballroom doors. I followed. The hallway outside the ballroom was quieter, lined with marble floors and dim wall lights. The moment the doors closed behind us, Claire spun around. Explain it. I took a breath. When you first showed me the platform idea, I realized it needed infrastructure to scale. Warehouses, fleet networks, servers. Things most startups can't afford. So you bought them? I already owned a lot of them. And instead of telling me you hid behind shell companies? They're not shell companies. Then what are they? Subsidiaries. She rubbed her temples like she was trying to physically massage the information into sense. So every time my company signed an asset contract, it was with one of my groups. And every time I renegotiated rates, my managers handled it. And every time I thought I was convincing investors to believe in my company, they already believed in you, I said. Because you told them to? Because your system works. Her eyes hardened. That's not the point. I know. Do you? She asked. She paced a few steps down the hallway. 5 years, she muttered. Then she turned back. Do the board members know? Some of them? Her jaw tightened. Which means I'm the only one who didn't. I didn't want to undermine your authority. She stared at me like that sentence might actually be the dumbest thing she had ever heard. You undermined it anyway, she said. How? Because if this ever gets out publicly, do you know what people will say? I didn't answer. They'll say my company was propped up by my husband's money. That's not true. They won't care. Her voice cracked slightly.
They'll say the self-made founder story was fake. I felt something twist in my chest. Claire, did you ever plan to tell me? She interrupted. Yes. When? I hesitated, and that hesitation answered the question for her. Jesus, Mark. She looked down the hallway like she needed distance from me just to breathe. I can't even tell what parts of my life are real right now. Everything you built is real. But the foundation isn't mine. The software is. That's not how companies work. Another long silence. Finally, she asked something quieter. How much control do you actually have? Over what? Over my company. The way she said my company carried a defensive edge. The infrastructure contracts give my holdings leverage, I admitted. Her eyes widened. What kind of leverage? If the agreements were terminated suddenly, it would be disruptive. How disruptive? I didn't sugarcoat it. Very. Her face went still. You could cripple the company. I would never do that. But you could. Technically, yes. She stared at me like a stranger. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. This wasn't just about the secret anymore. It was about power. Power she never knew I had. Why tonight? She asked softly. I didn't choose tonight. The board scheduled the introductions. You could have warned me. I tried to find the right moment. You had 5 years. That one landed clean.
The ballroom doors opened behind us as a group of guests stepped out laughing, unaware they were walking into a quiet disaster. Claire straightened her posture. Her voice turned colder. "I need air." She walked toward the hotel exit without waiting for me. I followed a few steps behind. Outside, the city air was cool and sharp. Traffic hummed along the street. Claire stopped near the curb and stared at the lights of downtown like she was trying to see her life from a distance. "You know what the worst part is?" she said after a minute. "What? For 5 years, I thought you were just being supportive." "I was." "No," she said quietly. "You were the most powerful person in my company." She turned and looked at me again. And I didn't even know it. The air outside the Monarch Hotel felt colder than it should have been. Claire stood near the curb with her arms wrapped around herself, staring at the traffic sliding through the intersection like she was watching something far away. The streetlights reflected faintly in her eyes, but she wasn't really looking at them. She was thinking. And the silence between us stretched long enough that I started to realize something had shifted. The anger was still there, but something else had joined it. Calculation. Claire had always been sharp when it came to business. It was one of the things I admired most about her. She could read situations quickly, adapt faster, and figure out angles other people missed. Right now, I could practically hear the gears in her head grinding. After a minute, she finally spoke again. "You said 90%, she said quietly. "Yes." 90% of the infrastructure. "Yes." She nodded slowly like she was reviewing numbers on a spreadsheet. "Warehouses?" "Yes." "Fleet?" "Yes." "Server farms?" "Yes." "And all of those are leased to my company?" "Yes." Another pause. Then she asked the question I had been dreading. "How long are the contracts?" "Most of them are 10-year agreements." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "When were they signed?" 3 to 4 years ago. "So they're locked in?" "Essentially." Claire looked down the street again. "You negotiated them with my operations team. My managers did. And they never once mentioned that the owner of the company was my husband?" "No." "Did they know?" "Yes." That earned a quiet, humorless laugh. "So everyone knew except me?" "I asked them to keep it confidential." She turned toward me. "Why?" "I told you." "No," she said. "You told me the pretty version. I want the real one." The city noise hummed around us. A taxi rolled past slowly, headlights sliding across the pavement. I took a breath. "Because if you knew I controlled the infrastructure, every success would feel like it came from me instead of you. That's not your decision to make." "I know. You decided what my reality was. I was trying to protect you." She stared at me like that word had personally offended her. "Protect me from what?" "From doubt." Her jaw tightened. "You mean from the truth?" I didn't answer. A group of guests stepped out of the hotel behind us, laughing loudly before heading toward a rideshare pickup zone. Claire waited until they were gone before speaking again. "Do you know how many times I've had panic attacks over infrastructure costs?" Her voice wasn't yelling anymore. If anything, it was worse. Controlled. "Last year, when we expanded into Texas, the asset fees nearly killed our margins." She continued. "I spent 3 months renegotiating warehouse capacity and server usage." "I remember." "You remember because you own the warehouses. I wasn't the one making the rates," I said carefully. "My managers handled those." "That's not the point." "I know." She shook her head again. "God, this is insane." Another long pause. Then she asked something that surprised me. "Did you ever make money off the contracts?" I blinked. "Yes." "How much?" "Claire." "How much, Mark?" I hesitated. "Roughly 80 million over the last 5 years." She went completely still. 80 million. I nodded once. Her lips pressed together. "And that money came from my company?" "It came from infrastructure operations." "It came from my company paying your company." The distinction didn't seem to matter to her. "You profited from my business." "I invested in it." "You never told me." "I know." Claire paced a few steps across the sidewalk, heels clicking softly against the pavement. "I pitched to venture capital firms while my husband quietly made $80 million leasing infrastructure to me. That's not the full picture." "What's the full picture then?" "The assets existed before your company." "Then why did you route them through my system?" "Because your platform made them more valuable." She laughed again, shaking her head. "You're unbelievable." I didn't argue. Because from her perspective, I probably was. After a minute, she turned back toward me. "Do you control anything else?" "What do you mean?" "Equity? In your company?" "Yes." "No." She studied my face like she was checking for cracks in the answer. "You're not on the cap table." "No." "You don't own shares?" "No." "So technically you don't own the company?" "No." "But you own the skeleton it stands on?" "Yes." Claire exhaled slowly. Then she asked something quieter. If I walked away from the company tomorrow, what would happen? The question caught me off guard. What do you mean? I mean, if I resigned. You wouldn't. Hypothetically. I thought about it. The board would appoint a new CEO. And the infrastructure? The contracts would stay in place. So the company would continue operating. Yes, but I wouldn't be part of it anymore. That's how companies work. She nodded faintly. Then she looked at me again. Do you see the problem here? Yes. Do you? Yes.
Because from where I'm standing, she said, it feels like my husband secretly built a safety net under my life, and then made himself the most powerful person in the room. I never wanted power over you, but you have it. I didn't deny that. The streetlight above us buzzed softly. Cars passed. The city moved, and the gap between us felt wider than the street. Finally, she asked something else. Does the board trust you? Yes. Why? Because the infrastructure works, and because you're married to the founder? That helps. Her expression shifted slightly at that, almost like a thought had just appeared. Wait, she said slowly. What? She looked at me very carefully. Did the board know you were my husband when the contracts were signed? Yes. And they were fine with that? They voted unanimously. Her eyes narrowed. So the board approved contracts that gave my husband control over the entire operational backbone of the company. They approved infrastructure agreements with a reliable partner, that partner being my husband. Yes. Claire turned away again. She paced several steps down the sidewalk, then came back. You know what's funny? She said quietly. What? For 5 years, I thought the hardest part of building this company was convincing investors to believe in the vision. She gestured toward the hotel behind us. Turns out, the biggest investor was sleeping in my bed the whole time. I wasn't an investor. You put the entire infrastructure network behind my company. That's different. How? Because I didn't take ownership of the company. You took $80 million. I couldn't argue with that. Another silence settled between us. This one heavier, more complicated. Claire finally leaned against a metal railing near the curb. Her shoulders dropped slightly, like the adrenaline from the argument was starting to fade. I don't even know if I'm angry at you or impressed, she said. That's not the reaction I expected. Oh, I'm still angry, she replied. Don't get me wrong. She looked back toward the hotel. But now I have another problem. What? She met my eyes. Everyone in that ballroom just watched my husband walk on stage as the majority asset owner behind my company. Yes, that story spreads by morning. Probably. And once it spreads, she continued slowly, people start asking questions. Yes, questions about conflict of interest. Possibly. Questions about control. Maybe. Questions about whether I'm actually the one running my own company. That one's done. You are. Perception matters. She was right. Claire looked up at the hotel again, then back at me, which means tomorrow morning, I'm either the founder who secretly built her company with her husband's financial backing, she paused, or I'm the CEO who just discovered her husband controls 90% of the infrastructure without telling her. Neither option sounded great. She rubbed her forehead. Jesus. I stepped a little closer. Claire, I can fix the optics. How? I can restructure the holdings. Transfer ownership? Possibly. She studied me again. You'd give up 90% of the infrastructure network? For you? Yes. That answer surprised her. I could see it in her eyes, but she didn't respond right away. Instead, she asked one final question. And the way she said it made my chest tighten. Mark, did you ever think about what would happen if our marriage went bad? I didn't like where that question was going. No, you should have. The words hung there in the cool night air. Because for the first time since this whole thing started, I realized Claire wasn't just thinking about the company anymore. She was thinking about us.